So, this afternoon we have, in fact, 5 instead of 6 student presentation, which means we end a bit earlier because one of the students who had been accepted to give a presentation, in fact, never came. We still have 5 very good presentations. A few points. First, there's been a request from members of the faculty that we would like all the students to introduce themselves one by one. At one point or another, at one point. So the idea is we'll do that after the break. So those students who are actually giving paper, that's 5 of them, they introduce themselves before giving their paper. Also, Louis was suggesting if they have introducing themselves, but they say something about their interest, and if they have some suggestion for the further roundtable, it's a good moment to make this suggestion. So we'll have 3 presentations, then a break, and then the introduction of those students who are not presenting today, self-introduction, and then 2 papers, and then we'll be done for today. For the faculty members, there are maps where you're supposed to go tonight, which will be passed around at the break. So to begin with, we have Claire Cooper directly from Ireland, Belfast, Northern Ireland.
Okay, so I'll introduce myself now. My name is Claire Cooper, as Nan said, and here as well. I'm from the Institute of Cognition and Culture, which is a newly established institute, and I am in my 2nd year of my PhD research. So the research I'm going to present today is ongoing. That's the excuses over. The discussions that I would like to see would probably be some of the issues that I'm going to raise, and I think some of the issues that Rita has raised about how I think there's a real need for psychology and anthropology to be combined in research. Okay, so the title of my talk is The Cognitive Foundations of Reincarnation Concepts, Implicit Reasoning about the Continuity of Identity. Just to give an overview, I'm going to discuss my leading research questions, then I'm going to discuss a little about my analysis of archived ethnographic reports on reincarnation beliefs. Then I'm going to appeal to relevant findings from the social cognitive sciences in order to interpret the ethnographic reports and also to lead to my hypotheses. And then I'm going to explain a bit in detail about the psychological research, a little about cross-cultural research. I'll explain when I get there. And finally, if we have time, which we may not, I will talk a little about my new ideas for the new types of developmental research working on identity. Okay, so to begin with, leading research questions. I'm interested in the area of personal identity. Needless to say, I'm not the first. So my question is, what does it take for an individual to exist through time and retain their unique identity? This is a metaphysical question, but it's also an epistemological question. So what I really am asking is, what do ordinary folk think it takes for, obviously that was too long, an individual to exist through time and retain their unique identity? I'm particularly interested in features of individuals, so more specifically, which features of that individual do we typically represent as stable? So let me give you an example. Physical, which is features that we can directly perceptually track, like someone's facial appearance, their behaviours, or non-physical or psychological characteristics, which would be things that we can epistemically represent, such as oh dear, Susan's writing already.
Just
Just kidding. Which would be things like your personality traits, your memories, what you usually think, believe, desire, etc., etc. So for an example, Albert Einstein, what is it about Albert Einstein that enables us to individuate him, represent him as a unique individual as compared to me? Is it something that was a bit of a bad example? Okay, let's use Larry. Larry, actually you're quite similar. Sorry. Is it his hair, is it his mathematical mind, or is it something else? Okay. Reincarnation concepts are very striking for researchers interested in personal identity. They've never been looked at before in this connection because they represent what are surely some of the most difficult change, that's not even art. Some of the most dramatic changes to individual persons imaginable. So the person is trapped through life, through death, and again through rebirth or reincarnation. The reason I've used the word concepts, by the way, is although reincarnation beliefs are traditionally associated with some religious traditions, more so than others, there's been some research in sociology which shows, and my own research, that there is something that is very appealing about the idea of reincarnation. There's something cognitively sticky, and I'm trying to find out what that thing is. So I'm looking at which features are most essential to identity. So it's the concept, the idea, not just the belief, and we'll not get into that discussion. Okay, so the first, to begin my research, I started to look at ethnographic reports. I will quickly just allude to this, and maybe in further discussion, if anyone's interested, I would be happy to discuss this with them. One of the major problems I found was that there was a huge abundance of reports on ethnographic beliefs, on reincarnation beliefs, but the word reincarnation itself was used, it's very promiscuous, and it's used a lot. There's no typology of reincarnation, and indeed, as Rita, I think, really rightly pointed out, why should researchers have looked at these questions that are very, very specific and that I'm looking at? So perhaps just to, before I go into this, just to help clarify what I mean by reincarnation, especially for anthropologists in the audience who, whenever I start to assert my claims, may well say, well, there are lots of examples of people who believe this, so I'll just take this pen. What I'm talking about is a specific individual person who, this is the cycle of death and life, who dies and then is reborn in the form of another specific individuated person, or a tree, or a fork. You get the idea, sorry, that's not a fork. So the point is that this has to be individuated. I have to be able to pick out this one person and trap that one person to this, or whatever it may be. It has to be a bounded object. What I also would like to say is that this, I think, is a slightly different representation than things like ancestor worship, where generally you tend to have, I think, an individual person or incarnation, where it's a ghost or a spirit, that ends up as one of many. Don't seem to be individuated anymore. They take on generic characteristics. They're malevolent. They have privileged access to our thoughts. So I think there is a finite distinction. And also there's another type of thing in the literature, which is where an individual spirit becomes associated with a mountain or with a forest, but it's not the same in my mind as that individual person becoming that individual mountain, that individual tree. So I think the key is the individuation. So just to make that clear, it's maybe confusing. Okay, so I looked at the only type of quantitative reporting of ethnographic, of reincarnation beliefs that I am aware of, and I would be really keen if any of the anthropologists especially do know of any type of research that would help. It is ongoing. I'm working my way through the human relations area files, but given the difficulties with this and the difficulties with some of it's very lengthy process, it has taken some time. So the only quantitative analysis that I know of at present is Amerindian reincarnation beliefs, and it's by Mills Slobodin and also with the help of Rupert Murdoch. So this is what they found. I'm going to present to you, amongst other things. They weren't just looking at reincarnation beliefs. In terms of, let me just use this, reincarnation type, they found, this is a frequency table if you like, 71 societies or subgroups had human to human reincarnation, human to animal 10. They didn't report any for human to plant or human to artifact. Secondly, when you look at method of identification, the prevalence, there's more than 130 here because some societies and subgroups obviously use more than one type. Autobiographical memories, 137, physical characteristics, 120, specialist identification, 28, and behavioural traits, 27. The reason I've used this isn't a characteristic. This would be, for example, shamanistic powers. The reason I've used this is just to illustrate that, of course, it's not just characteristics that people use. There are thousands of different means For example, this one here is the most popular. There would also be signs, types of footprints on a grave. Sometimes it's actually determined by conscriptions in society. So the third person born would be the reincarnation of X. But I am interested in these only, mainly because of the questions that I'm interested in. So it could be that there is a bias in the reporting of these guys, sure. It could be something special or unique to Amerindian reincarnation beliefs, sure. But what I want you to do is follow with me in the assumption that when I appeal to the findings from cognitive sciences, that something more general and more appealing to the human mind is actually going on here. So if you share with me the assumption, just allow me this one assumption, that those two headings actually represent something else. The first one represents ontology. So what I'm going to argue that this represents, more or less, is how easy it is for identities to survive transformations in kind. So how easy is it for a human to become another human and still be the same person? Human to animal, human to plant, human to artifact. I'm not arguing that these things aren't possible at all. I'm just arguing that they're less frequent than these, and I'm going to explain why. Secondly, identification procedures become central characteristics. That is, I'm assuming that because of these things are used to identify someone, A, they're presumed to continue, and B, they're more central to that individual person. I am also well aware that there is a distinction, and a very important distinction, between characteristics that are central to conceptual structure and also identification procedures. For example, it could just be that autobiographical memories are very specific and very peculiar to that individual. For the purposes of the talk, I'd like you to share with me just the assumption that it is related to central characteristics, and in the experiments I'll show how I think that I have successfully demonstrated that it's not just that they're peculiar or highly specific. There's something about them. Okay, here's the science part. I'm going to whiz by this in the interest of time, so please bear with me. Recent relevant findings from the social cognitive sciences. It's great that Larry has gone before me because he saved me this, which is intuitions about category membership continuity. The idea that, okay, so basically let me just illustrate maybe what this means. It means that how one individual, say my colleague Larry, sorry I keep using you Larry, is a member of the same kind. He's still a human despite transformations. What I'm looking at rather is how that individual Larry is still Larry despite transformations. There may not be mutually exclusive, but it is a slightly different question. We know from reasoning about intuitions about category membership continuity, indeed in the presence of Susan, who has done an abundance of work in this area, that even young children tend to have a preference for internal, non-obvious features as identity maintaining, and also perhaps as an essence. There's an essence to the person. I'd like to use that as an analogy, perhaps, to how we think about individual continuity, in that there is something about the individual that's internal, that's non-obvious, that may even be constituted as a type of essence. Okay, so there's actually been some work done here. In comparison to the work done in category membership, there really is a lack of work in intuitions and individual identity, I think. So the work in this area actually has tended to sway on the side that individuals can continue despite changing categories, so the person to animal can exist because intuitions about individuals are stronger. This also suggests that autobiographical memories have been argued to be what is most robust. Drawing on this, they're internal, they're hidden. I would argue that in some cases they're maybe even causal, and also that they provide causal and cognitive connections between belief states and desires. So they're a permanent feature of individuals, what we perceive to be a permanent feature. Furthermore, intuitive ontology, what we know about intuitive ontology is that generally we infer that these things exist in some types of kinds more so than others. Of course, it's much more muddy than this, so if I just quickly, so human, animal, and artifact. There are things like animacy, there are things like whether it's the intention of the creator of the artifact, whether the animate action is goal-directed or not. But these are all finite distinctions that I think perhaps we need to start with the more basic ontological kinds before we can weed our way down through. Is everybody with me so far? Okay. So the hypothesis that I'm providing is that identity can persist across any transformation in which the psychological capacities are represented as remaining intact. So in theory, I would argue that it is possible for human to artifact reincarnation so long as the people are able to endow that artifact with the ability to think, remember, believe, desire, etc. But because this kind of ontological kinds roughly maps on to psychological capacities, so what we tend to view animals and humans as capable of, I would argue that this is a rough approximation. So as transformational distance increases, people will be less likely to judge that an individual persists. This isn't just my hypothesis. Kyle also advocated it, looking at storytelling. But the difference is that a lot of authors have used this, but they haven't really explained why. So they've said, oh, because the transformation is more dramatic. But my question is, how is it more dramatic? Exactly how? What is it that's changing? Secondly, people will judge autobiographical memories as better cues to identify an individual than any other characteristics. Okay, so I obviously took this research to the lab. In theory, it should apply also to people who have no explicit belief in reincarnation, who are not in a culture where reincarnation is part and parcel of their everyday activities or interactions. Okay, the first question was one of ontology. This is an experiment that I devised with the help of Jessie Baring in Belfast. We did not use undergraduate students, which I think is a big plus, to be honest, and something that maybe needs to be addressed. We used a variety of different people. In fact, we used online studies. Maybe that's another debate. But we did get a variety of different types of people. So basically, this was the experiment. Students, workers, whoever had to imagine that they were the village elder of an imaginary village called Bongo. Not very exciting. Bongos believe that everyone who dies is reborn into a new form. Okay, this was more elaborate, but basically, it's over 1 year since the person died. The council can only remember certain things. So the villagers bring to you, the village elder, 5 different candidates, each of which may or may not be the true reincarnation of the deceased. Only one of these is a true reincarnation, but since you can't know for certain, you must rank these in terms of the probability or likelihood that each is in fact the true reincarnation. So the individual read a short description of the deceased and had to decide how likely it was that each of the 5 candidates were the true reincarnation. This is one variation of about 20. So council present you the following information about the deceased. The deceased was a woman called Jennifer. The only cues we had, woman Jennifer. The council members place before you 5 candidates, only one of which is the true reincarnation of Jennifer. The candidates are the following: an infant, a kitten, a rosebush, a rock, and a grass cutter. Okay, so they obviously map on to categories. We replicated this 3 times online with different participants each time. We also changed the example given, so we changed the sex. So Jennifer was her name obviously changed as well as her sex, and the amount of description of 5 kinds. So for example, we started to vary to say a rock that no one had noticed before, an infant that no one knew who the infant was. And each time the rank order followed the ontological structure and predictions in that human, animal, plant, artifact, man-made. I have to say we didn't have any strong predictions about these 2, but I think that there is room for more research in this area, and I did include them just as an interest post-talk. Participant agreement changed when we varied the abilities. So whenever, in some occasions, what I actually did was I endowed the animal, plant, artifact, and man-made artifact with psychological capacities. So I said, Colin remembered an old house. The human didn't remember an old house, the animal, the plant, the artifact, and the other artifact did. And what happened was, although the ontological structure was the same, participant agreement about animal shot up and participant agreement about human shot down. So it kind of illustrated that it's not just a simple mapping of ontological structure, but that it does seem to be something about the capacities of the kinds. Okay, we also looked at open-ended answers. So in addition to this is the fun part. I asked if you were the leader, the elder, and these candidates were brought before you, what would you do or say to the one that you have chosen in order to try to determine if it is the true reincarnation? And I looked especially at people who had actually chosen these artifacts, because what were their reasoning strategies? I mean, they could have just not been taking the task seriously, but I had these content analysis performed, and I found that I divided up all the different types of abilities, such as psychobiological, biological, perceptual, memory, the desire to think, and found that more than any, that these two were endowed with psychological capacities as much as were the other three. So in the participants who've chosen them, so central characteristics, I'm going to have to race through this. Basically, we divided the individual up into 4 categories. First question was, which property is the highest in each category, and which property overall? So, same thing again, only this time, this is the example for memory. So we had 4 different types of memory: procedural, autobiographical, etc., etc. And of the 4 highest were congenital trait, habit, personality, and autobiographical memory. I want to stress that I think the uniqueness of this type of research is that a lot of researchers have claimed that memories are important, but they haven't really compared them with any other types of characteristics. Okay, same thing again, comparing across, and autobiographical memory ranked the highest overall. I'm not going to explain this, but basically autobiographical memory and congenital trait was significantly higher than any of the other traits in all 3 examples. Okay, we varied the example of the autobiographical memory given, how particular the memory was. So a child remembers a friend dying in his arms during war versus a child remembers someone falling down some steps. We varied single memory versus memories generally. So we were afraid that people would infer that if someone had one memory, they had all. So we said, no, this individual only has this one single memory. We also varied the valence, positive or negative. In some work with Sean Nichols, I've also extended this. We've done more experiments, and we've looked at judgments about oneself. You have to choose a memory about yourself and predict which one is going to be your reincarnation versus others. We also changed the task, so it wasn't just a rank order, you had to choose one, and we also asked them, if you chose the memory, how confident were you that on the basis of one memory, the person was you? Then if the memory faded, how confident were you? Confidence ratings were somewhere along 70%, which again reinforces the idea that it's not simply the characteristic, but to me that it's some type of causal connection, as well as the specificity of the memory. So each time it was ranked significantly higher. Don't have time to go into this. Perhaps in the discussion I will. All I will say is that there is a new modus operandi of the Institute of Cognition and Culture that, as a psychologist, I'm trying to do basically the reverse of what Rita's doing, which is to try to engage in some type of research. I did have a research assistant, but the idea is to try to find a culture that initially challenges the hypothesis that you have. I chose genism because it seems that, explicitly at least, it is possible to be reincarnated as a human, an animal, a plant, and even a microorganism. All I wanted to do was see how this interacted with these two. So I did only 3 weeks of research, a pilot study, and this is ongoing. I do expect to be back a lot more. Okay, so I'm sorry I have to move on from that. Okay, future research. I want to do developmental studies. This is the last slide. I'm going to address questions in the developmental studies. Well, the first one is obviously what's the developmental trajectory of this type of reasoning. The first one is believability, and I want to show children an actual magic show where someone does actually transform into another character. Another one is representation. I'm not going to show them an artifact, a doll, and tell them this is a human. I'm going to physically show them a human. Vagueness, using names in isolation. Sometimes what you find is, in only some types of identity research, you present children with an object or a doll, and you say, this is called Sam. Now Sam's going to change, and so you change, and you say, okay, is this Sam? Using names in isolation, I think there are additional ways in which you can look at these questions, and I would love to discuss it with some of the researchers here who have done that type of work, but I don't have time to discuss it now. Okay, so finally, in my PhD research, I am attempting to more precisely specify the relative importance of distinct categories of psychological and physical traits on identity judgments. Using a combination of archival, psychological and cross-cultural research, I have argued that those who believe that reincarnation is possible, and even those who do not, implicitly represent identity as maintained by an individual's psychological capacities more so than any other characteristics. The final stage of my PhD research is to investigate the developmental origins of this type of reasoning. Thank you. Any questions? No. Am I to take questions? Yes, please.
You claim that people tend to rely more on psychological and autobiographical memories, information, than on behavior, habits, physical characteristics, because they have some kind of metaphysical belief that being an individual is having some set of psychological states and memories. It might be, in another interpretation, that psychological states just happen to be much more informative when you have to make judgments about who is whom. For example, if you take, for example, the different women who pretended to be Anastasia Romanov, you know, all these women they had, you couldn't judge the matter on the basis of behavior or physical characteristics, which was really ambiguous, but the autobiographical memories were taken by people at the time to the real test. So
well,
just
yeah, I think it's what I was getting at when I said that there is a distinction between what is central to conceptual structure. So what it is about you that makes you, and what it is that's easiest to identify you. Of course, the two aren't mutually exclusive. I think autobiographical memories do provide a quick and dirty way of me identifying that you are you if that is specific and that is highly particular to you. But what we did in the experiments is we actually changed the specificity of the memory. We made it much lower. So we said a person remembers someone falling down some steps. We actually then increased the specificity of the congenital trait. So we said instead of the person has a mark on their arm, the person has a half-moon shaped mark just above the right elbow. In all of those cases, what happened was the intuitions for autobiographical memories did drop, but I'm talking by about 2 or 3%. All the other intuitions, they shut up. So I think that it is something more. I've also done a lot of content analysis on asking people to define individuals, define reincarnation. Time and time again, I get this back. The identity continues, the essence, the soul, and if you look as well on World Wide Web memorial sites, you'll find a lot of this type of reasoning. They're not concerned with what the person looks like really, but they still infer that the person, you know, isn't necessarily playing a harp, but they're still, you know, missing them, that they still love them, that they're still thinking, they still remember them. So I think that what you're saying in the type of reasoning about congenital traits, I think that maps on exactly to that. But with autobiographical memories, I'm not sure that I'm convinced that it is just because it's a quick and dirty way.
You have great evidence. I just said you have great evidence.
Okay, great.
Yes.
I think.
Then you. Sorry.
You maybe know that in philosophy, I'm a philosopher called Lord.
Are you a philosopher?
And we had many thought experiments about personal identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking of one by Bernard Williams. He has this paper, The Silence of Future. So you know it.
Yes.
And just describing two different thought experiments, almost the same.
Mm-hmm.
You can completely change the intuition of the people. Either they reply, oh yeah, I identify to my body, or I identify my psychological beliefs.
Yes.
And I was wondering whether you intend to play with that.
I don't, because I think that thought experiments actually require a lot of higher order cognition. They're quite difficult, they're quite hard to follow, and I don't think that they do necessarily give us access to the type of online quick thinking that I'm interested in. I think that words certainly are important, and identity is vague, it is vague, but I think that by using a variety of ways to tap into concepts, we get a better understanding rather than just playing with words. The developmental reasoning is another way of getting at this. Cross-cultural research is another way. So I'm not just using these type of kind of similar to thought experiments in isolation. And I think that what I've highlighted or was going through the developmental studies is the way that you phrase questions and in identity research does have a huge impact on the answers. So I hope by using a variety of methods that I'm going to hopefully try to get a better understanding, more precise understanding. Does that make sense? Was there a question over here? Be nice to me, Dan. You know me.
Of course.
I'll burn your research.
One might, thinking about the frequency of reincarnation beliefs around the world, and I don't know how frequent they are, but they seem common enough that it isn't a particularly rare idea.
Well, typically they're tied up, actually, in all of these other types of beliefs.
Okay.
So,
but where I was going is, this is a misfiring of some evolved psychology, presumably.
go on, not the evolved psychology.
Well, I mean, unless we presume that reincarnation really does exist for the people who believe it, which I find rather implausible.
No comment. Have that in that, Corey. Just kidding.
Then this is some kind of an attractor. That is the notion that the individual persists beyond death. It's some kind of an attractor.
I think that, I mean, I haven't really looked too much at the evolutionary type, how this maps on, but I think that there is a story to be told, certainly about how robust our agent tracking is. If you were to stop representing someone the moment they walked out the door, in terms of fitness, it would be very disadvantageous. If you stop representing someone the moment they change their hair colour, their features, again, it wouldn't allow us to interact with agents in the environment. Why we don't discontinue the representation of an individual when they have undergone biological death, this is actually a research question that we're kind of looking at anyway, is peculiar, but I think, again, I know you're looking at the types of, you know, like perhaps even seeing the agent or their interactions that perhaps in other societies make it easier to stop representing the individual as continuing, but in Western societies certainly there is no real feedback, no cue that the individual has physically gone. So why would we expect our cognitive systems to be able to cope with, you know, if you walk out the door or someone tells me you're dead, I don't know that there's a huge difference. Does that answer? Sorry. I thought I'd give Larry a break.
Well, yeah, no, I would frame it using the terminology that I used earlier in terms of an error management issue. Right? The costs of assuming that an agent no longer exists when that agent in fact does exist are probably much larger than the costs of assuming that the agent doesn't exist when the agent in fact does. Did I get that right? No, the other way. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
One last question.
Pascal?
Yes, I wonder if you knew about this. There's some old experimental research by Jeffrey Hall.
By who, sorry?
Maybe Jeffrey Hall or something.
Yes, Jeffrey Hall.
Right,
He's actually just published something in 2005 which claims kind of the opposite of this. He says that within the category, it's easier, whenever someone changes within a category, you're more likely to say that they're not the same individual, but when across categories, it's...
You also have some experiments where you have little figures that have parts and they
Yes.
can construe it as
Yes.
a group that's an artifact or a group that's
Yes.
an animal that you try to play with, and those things lose their parts and you replace them with
Yes,
different
absolutely.
parts.
The individual
They're all
is...
red, if they're all white, you're asking
Yes,
people,
it's
what's your
an
original-
that actually was one of the original ideas I had for an experiment, and it's still something I'm playing with, but the idea is that the individual is more than the sum of their parts, which is of course what I'm arguing in terms of individuals and perhaps not artifacts, but you're right, this is very much closely related, so if there's one more question, please.
Okay, take it while you...
Oh, right,
stop
okay,
it.
sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Take the last question one time. You choose them.
Oh, I can't.
Okay, she asked first.
Okay.
You get
I just wanted to add in terms of you saying that individual is more than the sum of its features, and also the question of features being either easy, convenient for identification versus being really important for the representation of that individual. I've just done a study where I was asking people to describe individuals, highly promoted individuals with personality traits, behaviors, observable characteristics and roles, and after it took a bunch of feature importance measures, and one of the measures I was using was drawing causal theories and calculating causal status of those feature types, and it turns out that across different measures, and particularly personality traits tend to be consistently more causally central and more important for concepts of individuals. So it's not. It's
no,
just
I
a
agree.
clear
Actually,
idea that it's
Susan,
not
you've done
just-
some work on this also, looking at personality traits, right, and how they can be essentialized. No, not you, okay. No, there has been some. Susan Gilman, sorry. There has been some work looking at how personality traits may even be also essentialized. I'm not arguing that personality traits aren't important. If you look at what I was saying about the research and categories, it seems that internal, non-obvious, hidden causal features are most identity maintaining. That could be personality traits, it could be autobiographical memories, it could be a range of things. But I think that autobiographical memories tend to have something about them, a quality about them that the personality traits don't have. Namely that there is a sense of consciousness, a sense of agency, that it is my memory that belongs to me.
I wasn't arguing that they are more important than
Continue it privately, I'm sorry.
No.
Okay.
It's to support your
No, but there are lots of different things that can be maybe fill in the placeholder of this.
Well, thank you, Claire.
Okay, thank you.
Now,
So, good afternoon.